All right. Throughout the summer months, we have been, as a community, walking through the New Testament letter from the Apostle Peter to a community of churches in what we would call today Turkey. It was called different things at that point in time, but on the north side of modern-day Turkey, there was a number of churches that had grown due to the influence of Peter and Paul and the other apostles and the evangelists, and as the word was spreading. And as Peter, probably nearing the end of his life, probably in Rome, as he was approaching his own heavenly homecoming, he wanted to write some words of instruction and encouragement to them. And if you've not been with us all summer, don't worry about that. Today's message can stand on its own. But if you're curious about what we've already covered, you can go to our YouTube channel or to anywhere where you get podcasts and look for St. Peter, and you can find the messages that we've had this summer already. Last weekend, what we heard was some instruction and encouragement for believers going through challenging times, suffering for a variety of reasons, and what God might be inviting them to consider and do as a result of that. And in chapter 5, as we're now near the home stretch, this weekend and next weekend I'll cover chapter 5, he kind of lands the plane specifically speaking to leaders in those local churches, but in such a way that all of us can glean something from today as well. So that's kind of the path we've been on. Today we're going to spend a little time looking at the first 5 verses of 1 Peter. Here's how 1 Peter 5 begins. He says, "And now, a word to you who are elders in the churches. I too am an elder and a witness to the sufferings of Christ, and I too will share in his glory when he is revealed to the whole world." That word elder is a word that actually is used all over the New Testament. The Greek word presbyteros is actually the root word behind Presbyterian, which is a particular denomination that we know of in America today. Presbyteros could simply mean one who is older chronologically, or one who is respected sometimes as a result of being older chronologically. And in the first century, within the Jewish community, that word was used to describe the recognized spiritual leaders within their community. Alongside, you can see there maybe, if you can read that verse, Mark 14, the chief priests and the scribes. Okay? So oftentimes, Jesus would engage with the elders, the respected leaders in the Jewish community. In the book of Acts, what we see is that the early church used the same word to describe their spiritual leaders. So in Acts chapter 15, the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem gathered together. In Acts chapter 20, what we see is that Paul, wherever he would go and start churches, one of the first things he would do is identify godly men to be pastors. Elders is what he often called them in those local faith communities. Interestingly, by the way, in all of the cases it shows up, it's always plural. So it's never singular, it's always plural. And so he would raise up godly women and men, and the men he would call to this role of elders who would be responsible for the spiritual care of that community. So in Acts chapter 20, he's passing back through modern-day Turkey, but he doesn't have time to stick around, so he invites the elders of the church in Ephesus in particular to come and meet him at a coastal city for some time together and some prayer. Last example on this slide here is from James chapter 5, where James, who's the half-brother of Jesus, and he's one of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, he says, if you're ever sick, call for the elders of the church to come and pray for you, and in particular, also to anoint you with oil for healing. And so these are just a number of examples where we see spiritual leaders throughout the Christian community being referred to by this term of elder. It also can be used to describe people who are just older. So here's one example, 1 Peter chapter 5. Never speak harshly, Paul writes, never speak harshly to an older man, but appeal to him respectfully as you would to your own father. Talk to younger men. You see the contrast there, just chronologically, right? Talk to younger men as you would your own brothers. Treat older women, same word, by the way, presbyteros, but the feminine plural form, as you would your mother, and treat younger women with all purity as you would your own sisters. So Paul's teaching to young Timothy, a pastor, was to respect those who were older and treat everyone as you would your own family. In the same chapter, though, he uses the exact same word at the end of the chapter to refer specifically not just to older individuals, but also pastors. Here's an example, verse 17. Elders who do their work well should be respected and paid well, especially those who work hard at both preaching and teaching. So you see there the connection specifically to spiritual leadership in the pastoral ministry. And then he goes on to say, for the scripture says in Deuteronomy, you must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain. And in another place, words of Jesus, actually, Paul quotes, those who work deserve their pay. So the word can be used in both contexts, but most often it refers to the recognized spiritual leaders of a local Christian community. And so as Peter is wrapping up what he has to say, that's primarily the first use of the meaning that he has in mind. Today, though, what we're going to do is we're going to see how when he writes that, what he says can also apply to any of us, whether we're teachers or parents, grandparents, uncles, neighbors, or friends. And so what he writes first to pastors can also apply to all of us as spiritual leaders in our homes, classrooms, or in any community we find ourselves in. Okay? So what we're going to see is there are three words of wisdom that Peter wants to give to any one of us who have spiritual influence and authority in any of those ways. The first is this: to care for God's flock. Here's what he says at the end of verse 1 and verse 2. As a fellow elder, I appeal to you, care for the flock that God has entrusted to you. Some of you who happen to be parents, maybe you had this experience. I remember when we first brought our kids home from the hospital, I thought to myself, wow, why in the world am I qualified to raise a human being, right? Like I didn't get pre-qualified like I did for a credit card or a mortgage or anything like that. But here I am, and I'm responsible for this human. Okay? I don't have an instruction manual, kind of got to figure out what I'm going to do. Some of you may have had a similar experience, or sometimes maybe if you're in a classroom setting and you've got a class and it's a challenging class, you may be like, oh man, okay, I need to remember that these students, these children, whoever it is that God has called you to influence, they have been entrusted to you by God himself. That's where Peter begins. Okay, so if you're a parent, you can be thinking about your children. If you're a grandparent, your grandchildren, an uncle, you get the idea. Whoever God has in and around you, he says he has entrusted to you. But notice they ultimately belong to God. Okay, so they are entrusted to you, but they belong to God. That gives us this sense that when we are investing in the lives of whoever God has put into our care, he cares a lot about that because they're ultimately his children. So the first thing is to recognize this holy moment where God has called us to influence and shape the lives of whomever he has trusted to our care. And how do we do that? So that's where he goes next. He says we do that primarily through selfless service. Selfless service. Here's what he says. Watch over it, the flock, right? The people entrusted to your care. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Now, if any of you are in education, you've probably heard the phrase, that class, right? That class, if you're not in education, refers to a particular group of young ones who have some specialness in them. Maybe a little extra energy, maybe a little extra challenge, right? They're God's beautiful children entrusted to your care, but you know when you have that class, it's going to be a little more demanding this year. Some of you may think about not just a classroom setting, but you have a unique set of kids, and you're like, man, they take all my best energy and time. And you may think to yourself, I'm not sure how willing I am every single day when I'm going to my classroom or my kids are, taking over and terrorizing my house. Peter says, remember, when you are investing in their lives, you are also ultimately serving God. Now, why does that help? Well, when you are selflessly, willingly putting your best time and energy, sometimes feeling like you're not ever getting recognized, maybe not making progress. Maybe sometimes it seems like your kids are going backwards and not growing forwards. You're thinking to yourself, why am I even doing this? Does anyone even notice or care? Have you ever wondered that? Right? Ever thought that? Well, when you recognize that those who are entrusted to you, whether it's 1 or 21 or whatever it might be, when they're entrusted to you by God, and that when you are taking good care of them, you are ultimately serving God, then you have this awareness and recognize that God notices and cares. And He knows that you're not perfect, right? He knows that you'll get frustrated, you'll get stuck in a rut. Sometimes you'll do the thing you don't want to do. You'll yell, you'll get upset, you're going to say some things you don't really mean or wish you could take back. That's going to happen. God does. He knows that you're not perfect in what He's calling you to do. But He says, I have entrusted them to you, knowing that, knowing your frailty, your imperfection, your weakness, but also providing a solution and a help in that brokenness, frailness, and imperfection. He says, I know you're not perfect, but I am. And I am with you, especially when it's really hard. When your kids are rebelling, when you're not making any progress, when it's the depth of winter and you're like, how long is this school year going to actually go? Okay? When God sees what you are doing, He takes notice, and as we'll see here in a little bit, He also will honor and reward your hard work. So parents, grandparents, educators in the room, God watches, God knows, God cares, and He delights in everything you do to the best of your ability to help these young ones grow more like Him. Third thing, as you are taking good care of whoever God has entrusted to you, as you do so to the best of your ability, selflessly, willingly, not grudgingly, not with a harsh spirit, you lead by example. Here's what Peter says. Don't lord it over the people assigned to your care. Right? Don't just exert the positional power and authority you may have. I'm your parent, you must do what I say. Right? Sometimes you have to say that just to get out of a crisis mode. Okay? But lead them by your own good example. Just real quick, let me show you why this is true. Think for a second, who is a teacher that you had that made a big impression on you? Just give that some thought. A teacher you had who made a big impression on you. Okay, all together, all at once, shout out their name. Okay. Most of you, as far as I can tell, maybe all of you, had someone who came to mind. For me, probably one of the first ones, I could think of a number, but one of them early on was Mrs. Macy. And she was delightful because she made learning fun. And she had pets in the classroom. We had an iguana until it died, and then we had to bury it. That was interesting. And then we had a parrot, Crackers. And I don't remember a single thing that Mrs. Macy taught me, like a lesson, right, or information. But I remember the fun that she brought to learning. I remember her spirit. Most of the people that came to mind, you may have a similar experience where you don't remember the information per se, but you remember the impression that they made on you. And why is that? Well, it's because when you live out your life and your calling to the best of your ability with God's help and set an example of graciousness, kindness, humility, as we'll see, God uses that to shape the lives of whoever He has entrusted to your care. So since our principal's in the room, I have to say this. Teachers, still do your lesson plans, right? But remember, it's actually everything else around that has a much greater impact. So you being you, with God's help to the best of your ability, as teachers, as parents, grandparents, neighbors, and friends, has the ability to shape the lives of whoever God has already placed in your care. Verse 4, I said God honors and rewards your hard work. Here's what He says. And when the great shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor. All right? Teachers, maybe you want to take this verse and put it at the end of your school calendar, right? Or maybe midway through. You'll receive glory and honor. How many of you watched the Olympics over the summer? Okay, a number of you did. Do you guys remember when they would do this? Anyone know why do they bite the medals? What's that? Prove that it's gold. And how does biting it prove that it's gold? It's supposed to be soft. Now, some of you may know this, maybe most of you don't. My front two teeth are porcelain crowns because I had a sledding accident with one of my brothers when I was a kid. So the thought of me putting a piece of metal in my mouth and biting on it just makes me cringe. Maybe that's true for you too. I don't know, right? But apparently, back in the day especially, to prove that something was actually gold, because it's softer, you would bite on it. And if you could make an impression, then you knew it was real gold. I don't think there's a question for the U.S. Gymnastics team here that they got real gold or silver or bronze or whatever it is. They bite it primarily for the photo moment, right? That's why they do it now to this day. But they know that what they have in their hands is something precious, and they'll hold on to probably for the rest of their lives, maybe pass on to their children and grandchildren. But the original Olympics didn't give out medals. Who knows what they gave out to the winners? Laurel wreaths, right? Okay, so made out of olive branches or whatever it would have been, right? And that was the crown they received as the victor. Peter says the crown we're going to receive is more like these gold medals, right? It's something that is precious and valuable and will endure for forever. Peter says God sees your hard work. He sees your dedication, your humble service as parents, grandparents, educators, neighbors, and friends. And he takes notice and he will celebrate and reward all of the investment you are making into the lives of whoever he has entrusted to your care. So don't grow weary. Do not give up. God is at work in and through you. Now, before we close, there's a couple words he gives, not just to those who are older or the spiritual influences, but also those who are receiving the influence. He says, in the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders. Now, I know we sent about a bunch of our kids out of the room, but for those of you who are in the room, what this means is when you're a student, respect your teacher. Those of you who have parents or grandparents in the room, respect and honor them. We've already heard they're not perfect, but God has given them responsibility to care for you. And in return, the scripture says, honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you, and that you may enjoy a long life on the earth. God attaches a promise to this invitation to respect and obedience. And that same posture, in fact, he actually spreads out to everyone in the room. So here's where he closes, verse 5, the second half. All of you, dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another. Why? From Proverbs chapter 3, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So as all of us all together, like Jesus, humbly love and serve and show respect and honor to each other, God is at work to shape lives and transform them for eternity. To close, before we send you off with a blessing, we have some questions for you to think about. If you're on your own, you can just ponder this. If you're with someone, lean over, and from what you've heard today, whatever God might be stirring up in you, what comes most naturally for you? Secondly, what do you find most challenging in what you're hearing today? And thirdly, especially because our theme all summer has been standing firm, how does it encourage you to stand firm? Before we're done, we want you to give some space to think about this. So if you're with someone, share what comes to mind. If you're on your own, give it some thought, and I'll send you with a blessing in a couple minutes.